Manhattan was not swapped for a nutmeg island. The treaty everyone cites says something colder. At Breda, in 1667, England and the Dutch ended a war on one rule: each side keeps what it holds. England already held New Amsterdam, the Dutch already held Run, a nutmeg island 2.5 miles long. Neither side handed anything over. Each kept what it had already taken. 10 pounds of nutmeg cost less than an English penny in the Banda Islands. In London it sold for more than £2. That price was not a fact of nature. Somebody built it. The tree looks ordinary. It grows to about the height of a house in volcanic soil under the shade of taller trees, and it takes years to fruit. The fruit looks like a small, pale apricot. When it splits, there is a hard brown seed inside, wrapped in a scarlet net of tissue. The seed, dried, is nutmeg. The net, dried and flattened, is mace. One fruit, two commodities, sold separately. For most of recorded history, it grew in commercial quantity in one place, about 10 small volcanic islands in the eastern Indonesian archipelago, in a sea later named after them. The Banda Islands. Together they amount to a few dozen square kilometers of land, most of it slope. The people who lived there were not farmers in the way Europeans later imagined them. Banda could not feed itself. The islands were too steep for rice, so the Bandanese grew a crop nobody else had and traded it for everything else: rice from Java, cloth from India, iron, ceramics, dried fish. Their boats went west to Javanese and Malay ports, where Chinese, Gujarati and Arab merchants were waiting. By the time nutmeg reached a European table, it had passed through several sets of hands. Authority on the islands was spread out. Each village had its leading men, the orang kaya roughly, the rich men, though wealth was only part of it. They negotiated, set terms, and competed with each other for buyers. What they did not do, and structurally could not do, was speak for the archipelago. There was no king in Banda. There was no single signature. Anyone wanting exclusive rights to nutmeg would have to persuade not one ruler but dozens of men, every one of whom made his living from having several buyers rather than one. The first Europeans reached the source around 1512. A small Portuguese party found the islands, bought nutmeg, and sailed away. They came back to trade, and for the better part of a century that remained the arrangement. Portugal took its cut along the route, but at the source, the Portuguese were customers, and the Bandanese set the terms. What none of them controlled was what happened to the price once the nutmeg left. In Europe, nutmeg was not primarily a flavour. It was medicine. Physicians across late medieval and early modern Europe held that plague travelled through corrupted air, and that strong aromatics could keep that air out of the body. Nutmeg was among the most highly regarded of them. Wealthy Londoners carried pomanders, perforated metal balls packed with spice, and pressed them to the face in infected streets. When plague came, demand rose, and so did the price. It did not work. The belief was wrong, and the market built on it was real, and that combination, genuine demand resting on a mistaken idea, is where the price began. The second half of the price was distance. Nutmeg passed from Bandanese sellers to Javanese and Malay shippers on to Indian ports, then to Arab and Ottoman merchants, and from there to Venice, which sold it northward. Every hand took a margin, and every hand had a reason to keep the source vague. Across most of Europe, the origin of nutmeg was, in practical terms, a trade secret kept by people who had never been there either. The arithmetic at the two ends of that chain explains everything that follows. At the islands, 10 pounds of nutmeg could change hands for less than an English penny. Landed in London, the same 10 pounds fetched over 2 pounds. No single seller created that gap. It was the accumulated cost of ignorance and mileage. When Portuguese ships found a route round Africa, they cut out the Venetians and the Ottomans. The price did not collapse. Portugal had simply become another owner of a link in the chain. But there was one thing about nutmeg that pepper, cinnamon and cloves did not share. Pepper grew in India and Sumatra. Cinnamon grew in Ceylon. Cloves grew across several islands in the Moluccas. Nutmeg, in commercial quantity, grew in Banda and nowhere else on earth. A crop with many addresses can be traded. A crop with one address can be owned. In 1602, the Dutch government merged a set of competing merchant companies into one and gave it a charter, creating the United East India Company, known then and since by its Dutch initials, the VOC. What made the charter unusual was not the trading privileges, it was the rest. East of the Cape of Good Hope, the company was authorized to sign treaties with foreign rulers in its own name, to build fortresses, to keep soldiers and warships, to appoint governors, and to make war. It was a commercial firm carrying delegated powers of a state. Within a decade it had forts, garrisons, and a governor-general in Asia, and it was signing treaties in its own name with rulers on the other side of the world. When the VOC later did something that looks, from a distance, like an act of government, that is because the charter had made it one. The company also had shareholders, and shareholders expected returns on a scale that ordinary trading could not deliver. Those returns were never going to come from buying well, they would come from controlling supply, because a company that buys a spice competes on price. And a company that owns the only place it grows does not compete at all. So the VOC went to Banda and asked for a contract. Not a purchase, but an exclusive right to all nutmeg produced, permanently. Some of the Orang Kaya signed. Under Bandanese practice, a man's agreement bound his own village and his own harvest, which was all he had to sell. The company read the same document as a transfer of the archipelago. When nutmeg kept leaving Banda on Javanese and English ships, as it always had, the Dutch treated it as a breach. In 1609, an admiral named Pieter Willems Verhoef arrived with a fleet and began building a fort on Neera without permission. The Orang Kaya proposed talks, and Verhoef agreed to meet them inland. It was an ambush. Verhoef and more than 30 of his men were killed. The company's ships then bombarded Neera and Lontor, destroyed settlements and burned boats. Neither side treated 1609 as an isolated incident. For the Bandanese it confirmed that a Dutch agreement arrived with cannon behind it. For the company, it confirmed that no contract would ever produce a monopoly. And then a second armed company arrived. The English East India Company, chartered 2 years before the VOC, began buying nutmeg in the Bandas and offering something the Dutch would not, a buyer who did not demand exclusivity. 2 corporations with warships now wanted the same 10 islands. The people living on them were about to find out what it meant to be the ground 2 companies stood on. Run is a rock. 2.5 miles long, no natural harbour worth the name, nutmeg growing on slopes that drop straight into the sea. In 1616 it was one of the last places in the Bandas the Dutch company did not control. In December of that year, an English captain named Nathaniel Courthope anchored 2 ships off the island. What happened next is usually told as an English decision. It was a Bandanese one. The people of Run offered sovereignty over their island to the English crown, and Courthope accepted. Run was not looking for an empire, It was looking for a shield. The Dutch response was a blockade. English relief was attempted more than once and did not get through. The ships sent to reinforce him were taken. Courthope had roughly 40 men, a stockade above the water, and a crop he had no way to ship out. They held for nearly 4 years. There was no strategic reason to spend 4 years on a rock, except the one that mattered. As long as a single island flew another flag, the monopoly was not a monopoly. In October 1620, Courthope was crossing to a neighbouring island at night when Dutch vessels intercepted him. He was shot, and he died. The English hold weakened quickly, and within a few years the Dutch had taken the island and destroyed its plantations. What did not die was the claim. Run had been ceded to an English king by its own inhabitants, and that cession sat in the East India Company's records and, through them, in the papers of an English government. In the half-century after Courthope's death, the two countries went to war twice, and each time English negotiators arrived with a small green rock in the Banda Sea somewhere on their list. The company had learned something from those 4 years, and it was not a lesson about the English. Ships could be driven off and forts taken. The problem was that the islands kept inviting them back. As long as Bandanese had nutmeg to sell and a reason to want more than one buyer, the exception would return. 4 years at Run had shown the company that an island could be taken and the problem would still come back. The man who decided to remove the problem itself was the company's Governor-General, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Cohen had argued for years that trade in the Indies could not be secured by agreement. His correspondence with the directors in Amsterdam is not the writing of a man in a rage. It is administrative. It discusses the security of the company's position, the unreliability of local contracts, and the advantages of a banda held directly and worked by people the company supplied. The most disturbing thing about the record is how ordinary the language is. In late February 1621, Cohen arrived off Banda with 15 ships and 1,655 men. He came for Lontor, the largest of the islands, the one the English had called Great Banda. The Bandanese who could fight withdrew into the hills. Those who could not were held in the villages below. On the 24th of April, after weeks of failing to bring the population down from the interior, Cohen's council took a decision recorded in the company's own minutes. Lontor was to be emptied. By the end of that month, around 1,200 people had been shipped off the islands. On the 8th of May, 47 Orang Kaya were brought to Fort Nassau on Neera and interrogated. 44 survived the interrogation. All 44 were found guilty and executed the same day by Japanese mercenaries the company had brought with the fleet. Nearly 800 of those taken were shipped to Batavia, the company's capital on Java. In January 1622, the survivors there were summoned to the castle, where the men were questioned and enslaved, and the women and children were sent back to work as slaves. The Dutch museum record that holds these figures notes something else about them. They did not settle. What they wanted was to go home. Historians have spent decades on the question of total loss. Willard Hanna and Vincent Loth both concluded that roughly 90% of the population was killed, enslaved or driven off in the campaign. The absolute numbers are still argued over. One older account puts the pre-conquest population at about 15,000, while more recent work by Hans Strava estimates Lontor alone at 4,500 to 5,000. That disagreement is a reason to be careful with the total. It is not a reason to soften the proportion. The Dutch National Archives files the events of 1621 under a single heading: genocide on Banda. Historians of the period use the same word. Some Bandanese got out. Boats reached the Kei Islands, a long way east, and Seram to the north. The people who landed there founded villages, kept their language, and kept singing about where they had come from. Back on the islands, the company had what it came for: 10 islands, a nutmeg crop, and nobody left to negotiate with. It also had a problem it had not thought about carefully. The trees were still standing, and nobody the company employed knew the first thing about how to make them produce. What the VOC did next was not improvisation. It was survey work. The confiscated land on the Nutmeg Islands was measured and cut into standard units called perken. Each perk was a defined block of groves, and each was leased to a single holder, a perkenier. The holders were mostly former company employees, men who had finished their service in Asia and wanted land. They did not own the perk. They held it from the company, on the company's terms. Land alone produces nothing, so the VOC supplied labour the way it supplied the land. Each perk came with an allocation of enslaved people, around 25 to a perk, issued as an input. Some were bought from elsewhere in the archipelago and beyond. Some were Bandanese, taken in 1621. Then the company closed the other end. A perkenier could sell his nutmeg to exactly one buyer, at a price that buyer set. The VOC held a monopoly over what left the islands and a monopsony over what came off the trees, at the same time in the same place. And here the record becomes hard to read, because it shows the company doing something its own campaign had almost made impossible. Nutmeg is not a simple crop. The trees are male and female, and a grove without the right proportion of them will not fruit. They need shade, which means growing and maintaining other trees around them. The harvest runs several times a year. The fruit has to be opened by hand, the mace peeled off whole, and the seed dried slowly enough not to spoil and fast enough not to rot. None of that is obvious. It is inherited knowledge, built up over generations on 10 islands by the people who worked them. So the company kept them. Bandanese who had survived the conquest and the deportations were put back on the groves they had come from, now as property, because they were the only people alive who understood the trees. The expertise the VOC had spent 1621 destroying turned out to be the one asset it could not seize, manufacture or ship in. The arrangement that followed was not an aftermath, it was the point. The conquest had been the capital cost, and the perk system was the operation, and by 1628, 7 years after the killing, every perk on the islands had been laid out. It outlived the company that built it. The perkeniers were not, for the most part, wealthy men. Many ran up debts to the company for supplies and for the people it had allocated them, and a perk could be taken back. They were middle managers with a lease. For most of that time, the islands worked steadily and quietly. Nutmeg was spread on drying floors and turned by hand, then sorted, sacked, and weighed. On a company chart, it looked like agriculture. The VOC now controlled the land, the labour and the buying price. One number was left that it did not control, and it was the number that mattered. A monopoly does not automatically produce a high price. It produces control over quantity, and quantity is what sets price. Good harvests were therefore a problem. In Amsterdam, when the warehouses held more nutmeg than the market would take at the price the company wanted, the surplus was destroyed. Stock that had been grown, dried, sorted, shipped halfway round the world, and unloaded was burned, in the open, on purpose. The company did not regard this as waste. It was price maintenance, and it is the clearest single statement of what the business actually was. The company also tried to own the seed. Nutmeg for export was treated with lime, in the belief that this would kill the germ and stop anyone planting it elsewhere. Trees growing outside the licensed islands were cut down, and expeditions went out to check. The intention was to make a living thing behave like a manufactured product, available from one supplier only. For a while it worked well enough that nutmeg stopped behaving like a commodity and started behaving like an asset. In its strongest years, the VOC paid dividends in the region of 40%. 10 small islands, worked by people who had themselves been issued along with the land, were producing a return a government could count on. Which brings us back to Breda. In 1664, an English fleet sailed into the harbour at New Amsterdam and took it without a fight. The town on Manhattan was a fur post of a few thousand people, losing money for years. War followed at sea, and by 1667 both sides wanted it finished. The settlement signed at Breda that July did not exchange colonies. Its third article set one principle, that each party keeps what it holds, with a cut-off date of the 20th of May 1667. The English kept New Netherland because they were sitting in it. The Dutch kept Run because they had retaken it long before the talks began. They also kept Suriname and a fort on the African coast, the detail that usually falls out of the story, and the one that shows it was never a two-for-one trade. What each side gave up was a claim. The Dutch dropped theirs to New Netherland, the English dropped theirs to Run. That is where the swap story comes from, and it is why the story is nearly true. But no territory moved at Breda. The paperwork only caught up with what the fleets had already settled. The treaty says nothing about which was worth more. It did not have to. Both governments had spent years acting on an answer. A fur post in North America mattered less to the Dutch Republic than a secured position in the spice trade. In 1667, that was arithmetic, not a blunder. Nutmeg was not simply valuable. It had been made valuable. The monopoly lasted another century, and then it ended without a battle. Pierre Poivre was a French administrator and botanist who spent 30 years trying to break the Dutch hold on spices, largely by stealing plants. In June 1770, working through local intermediaries with their own reasons to help, he delivered smuggled nutmeg and clove seedlings to Mauritius. Earlier consignments had died on the voyage. Enough of these survived, and by 1778 they were fruiting. From Mauritius the plants went to Réunion and on to the Caribbean. When British forces seized the Dutch Spice Islands in 1796 and 1810, they did the same on a larger scale: Penang, Ceylon, the West Indies. Grenada took to it so well the nutmeg ended up on its flag. None of that should have been possible, and the reason it was possible is almost comic. Nutmeg spreads in the wild the way most fruit trees do. An animal eats the fruit and moves the seed. In the Bandas, that animal is a large fruit pigeon which swallows the nut whole and deposits it somewhere else entirely. Through the whole period, the company was liming nutmeg and cutting down unlicensed trees. Birds had been carrying viable seed off the islands. The enclosure had never been complete. It had only been complete on paper. Once the crop grew in several oceans, the price did what prices do. Nutmeg became ordinary. By the middle of the 19th century, the Banda plantations were no longer producing a return worth defending. Slavery in the Dutch East Indies was abolished in 1860, and on Banda around 1,100 people were freed. 73 of them signed new labour contracts, the rest left. In 1873, the state's purchase monopoly was lifted for good. The Perkin did not disappear. The trade passed to a commercial bank, then to an association of growers, and the estates ran on until the Japanese invasion of 1942. What the system was built to protect had gone. What it had done to the islands had not. Indonesia is still the world's largest producer of nutmeg by a wide margin, and a large part of the growing area sits in the eastern islands, the Bandas among them. On Banda itself, growers spread nutmeg on tarpaulins outside their houses to dry, much as it has been dried for 400 years. Reporting from the islands in the early 2020s put dried nutmeg at roughly 70 to 85,000 rupiah a kilogram, with mace fetching several times that, though grades and seasons move those numbers. It is a real income, and it is not a fortune. The buyers are exporters and processors, and the price is set a long way from the islands. Local cooperatives have been working to sell direct, which tells you where the value stops. The islands produce, they still do not price. A few hundred kilometers east, in the K Islands, there are villages called Banda Elai and Banda Elat. The people there are descended from Bandanese, who got out in 1621. They still speak a Bandanese language, and they still have songs that describe an archipelago. Most of them have never seen an account of the conquest and the flight, carried orally for 4 centuries in a place the Dutch archives never reached. In 2021, 400 years after the 8th of May, there were commemorations in both countries. A Dutch museum ran a project on the nutmeg trade. Scholars published new work using the word genocide. The community at Banda Elai wrote to the city of Hoorn about the bronze statue of Jan Pieter Zoon Koen that has stood in its central square since 1893, and asked for it to come down. The Dutch state has apologized for slavery. As of August 2026, it has not issued a specific recognition of what was done at Banda in 1621. The statue is still there. Nutmeg is cheap now because the enclosure failed, not because anybody decided the arrangement had been wrong. The seed got out, the price fell, and nobody was compensated by that least of all the islands that were emptied to make it expensive in the first place. Most people who own nutmeg own it ground, in a small jar, and have never seen the fruit or the scarlet mace wrapped around the seed. It costs a few dollars and sits at the back of a cupboard for years. 2 governments once sat down and decided what that was worth. Somebody still decides. It has never been anyone on Banda. There are more of these on the channel One Commodity, One System, and the bill somebody else paid.